exploring today. Looks like we're going to record the session. The tool that we are going to be exploring together today, while we're discussing it in the context of a school, can be transferred to programs, after school or out of school time activities. So it can be universally used. We're just kind of couching it in the work that we do, which is MTSS-B. And then finally, we are going to share some of our technical assistance efforts coming out of our office and in conjunction with BHII. So just to lay the groundwork of our office and what we do, you can see the state is kind of broken down into 5 regions, and that's how we typically offer our technical assistance. Katherine and myself both serve a specific region of New Hampshire in supporting schools and districts to collaborate with their community partners and build their multi-tiered system of support. And we do this work primarily through grant funding. So we receive grants through SAMHSA and through the DOE to support this work in collaboration. So now you know a little bit about us and our office. We wanted to set the stage for us around substance misuse in New Hampshire. So the data on the screen is pulled from the 2019 Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is a survey given to New Hampshire high school students where they offer their own voice and feedback in their experience. So we averaged all of the results to get these numbers down to an average New Hampshire high school classroom. So we found an average classroom is about 25 students. And of those 25 students, we found that 9 of those students have felt sad or hopeless almost every day for the past 2 weeks. We also found that 8 students live with somebody who has used or abused drug or alcohol. 7 of those 25 students reported currently using marijuana. 5 have seriously considered attempting suicide in the past 12 months. 5 of students have been offered, sold, or given illegal drugs on school property. 5 students reported binge drinking, and 2 have a parent or caregiver in jail or prison. And what this data really serves is kind of the foundation for why we do the work that we do. We know schools are on the front lines for a lot of what students are coming to school with. And this is kind of a cross section of what students are coming to school with. And so when we know what they're coming to school with, we know how to better serve them. So MTSS-B, or the multi-tiered system of support for behavioral health and wellness, consists of these 3 kind of core features. We adhere to the system of care values. These values are things like youth-driven, family engagement, community collaborations, culturally and linguistic competencies. All of these system of care values is what drives the work that we do. And then we have some core strategies and routines that we'll dig into throughout this presentation that stand up the framework, and some essential ingredients, which I'll dig into on this next slide. So when we're talking about MTSS-B, we're talking about social, emotional, and mental health supports for all students. And we do this through a tiered prevention framework, which most of us have likely seen, things like PBIS or the RTI pyramid. It all kind of falls through that same pyramid type structure, along with an integrated delivery system of supports with a focus on not just student access to supports, but positive student outcomes. And we'll get into how we measure those outcomes throughout this presentation. So when we talk about MTSS-B, we talk about it in these kind of cyclical steps. And you'll notice as I talk through them that this is not an uncommon process. You would see something like this happening at any sort of planning stage or change management program. So we're going to mobilize people into strategic teams to use relevant data to make a plan, to implement evidence-based, data-driven practices and strategies, and monitor progress for outcome. So much like a teacher would, or a school would mobilize teachers into curriculum teams to support students, we would do the same thing for behavioral health and wellness. So when we think about mobilizing people into teams, and again, this is a school lens, but this could be transferred, to different after-school and out-of-school time programs or other spaces. There's a district level team that kind of drives the work in creating supportive policies and procedures. So this is a planning and implementation team that has key decision makers sitting down monthly to look at data and determine what is the area of focus that our school or our other implementation teams need to focus on. And then at the school level, there's some grouping of these 3 tiered teams. Some schools have a tier 1, a tier 2, and a tier 3 team. Some smaller schools or programs combine them and have a tier 1 team and then a tier 2, 3 team. And what we found is that as long as you're focusing in on that tier 1 level of supporting 100% of students in preventative practices, and then at the tier 2, 3 level, parsing out what is student support, what is student support that is needed, and then what is systems level support that is needed. You can really combine these teams in any way that makes sense for your current setting. But the key here is that there's conversations around individual student support, and then there's also those key conversations around what are the systems and structures we need to either implement or improve our current processes around. And so these are just a few considerations when you're thinking about a tiered teaming structure. You would want to meet relatively regularly, at least once per month. Use structured agendas, roles, problem-solving operating procedures so that you're keeping the work moving forward. Routinely review data, action plans, and monitor implementation progress so that you know whatever you're implementing, particularly a preventative program, that you're seeing the student outcomes over time. So once you have that team set up, we're going to then inventory and use the data we have at our fingertips to make sure that our plans are data-driven to support student identified needs. So when we're thinking about data, the first thing we would want to do is inventory what data we already have available to us. Again, these are school-specific data points, but you could extrapolate this to many different programs. So you may have office discipline referrals, attendance, academic scores or engagement, nurse visits for things other than medication dispensing, any community data, the YRBS like we shared at the onset of this presentation. And then you need to, you would sit down and think about this data we have available, how are we effectively using it to inform the work that we're supporting our students in? So the example of the YRBS data at the beginning of our presentation, how are we using those numbers to target universal preventions for our students? And you may come to the table with all this data and then realize you actually may need additional data points, in which case, how would you collect that data in a meaningful way to inform your work? So this is one example of how our office collects data in a meaningful way to help tell a story and make decisions about what we're seeing. This is a community data profile where we compare the county with which your school or program resides to all other counties in New Hampshire. So we can make comparisons around income, poverty level, food insecurity from our community with which we live to those that which surround us within the state. And all of these data points are publicly available through things like the CDC website. We use a couple other data platforms, and it's all available again on that technical assistance website that Katherine alluded to, and we will share a link to at the end of this presentation. Another way we make meaning is by comparing your district to all other school districts within New Hampshire. And again, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, this is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So not just taking a look at New Hampshire wide, but how do we stack up our district against all other districts? Are there some data points that are significantly lower and maybe a strength of our district, or are there data points that are significantly higher than the state average? And those might be areas that we would want to focus our attention on. So again, once you've got the team and you've got the data in a meaningful way, you want to review that existing data relatively frequently, monthly if it's appropriate, like attendance and nurse visits, those would be appropriate to review monthly. And then some other data points like the youth risk behavior survey, we really only get those every 2 years. So as it comes in. And then you would use the data to create an action plan, which I'm going to pass off to my partner, Katherine, in a minute to discuss, and then monitor your progress over time. So are you seeing things like office discipline referrals going down or a measure of school climate improving? And then identifying what needs and gaps you have based on that. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Katherine to take us into making a plan.
Thank you, Molly. And as Molly has emphasized throughout, MTSS-B, while it is school-based, is also really reliant on a collaborative approach with community members. So I'm thinking about, some of our participants here today. You may work for a community organization or that serves students in some way, and it might make a lot of sense if you're working closely with a district that does have MTSS-B, that has a district community leadership team, for you to sit on that team. That would be one way to participate, or even providing some guidance to the school-based tiered teams. So that's a way it can also connect. And so if you were participating in that team at the school or working within a region that has MTSS-B, that team would sit down to make a plan based on that data that Molly had just talked about. A pretty basic action planning process. We do have some tools and guidance to go with it, but really it's about sitting down and setting up some strategic goals. Again, looking at that community data, if the district, to tie it back into, substance misuse, if the district is noticing, wow, our county has higher than average opioid overdoses, is there something we could set a goal around on this team to address district-wide, or if it's a school team within our school? Is there something we need to be doing for families or even prevention education for students? Using those data points to really inform which goals are used. We always encourage these types of teams to set a few goals. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew, but coming up with a few concrete goals based on those data points, and then developing the strategies and aligning it to other district-wide or community efforts that have been pushed forward is really helpful, just to not have separate initiatives. And part of this making a plan is selecting specific strategies. And that's really what this presentation is geared towards today. Looking at the specific, you can move forward, Molly, if you want to, but thinking about, what specific strategies would help support those goals that we've selected and identified as either a district level team or a school-based team. And so go ahead, Molly, to the next slide. As Molly mentioned, we are we're the Department of Education, so it is very education school setting focused, but the tool that we'll present in this next section could be used within any organization to help select a practice or an initiative. And it just presents some really nice questions to have for discussion within an organization who's trying to select a program to use. So one of the foundations of MTSS-B, as the name suggests, is having a multi-tiered system of supports. And here you can see in a little bit more detail what those tiers represent. It is a prevention-based model. And so tier 1 is really that non-negotiable universal prevention supports for all students. What are all students in a school building receiving to support them in behavioral health and wellness? Tier 2 is focused on more targeted interventions for students who've been identified as needing more support. They're not responding to those universal supports as hoped. And so how do we connect them with, or how does the school and district and community connect them with the supports that they need? There's a couple ways that students can be identified for tier 2 supports. So one would be a simple request for assistance that usually takes the form of a form that staff could fill out. Most commonly it's staff, but it's really great when that request for assistance is offered as well to families, to students themselves to self-identify, or any other relevant people in the student's life, as well as universal screening. And here in New Hampshire, we have a non-academic survey law. So any universal screening at a school, if it is done, we usually suggest using a teacher-rated screening tool, because if not, students will need to opt in to taking a self-rated universal screening tool to say how they're doing using social and emotional criteria. And that can really, it makes it, ultimately what happens is it becomes not a universal process if students need to opt into it, because you end up with not all the forms back. So not all students are being screened. So using a teacher-rated tool is one way to do it. Another way to do it is through selecting a few data points that a school-based team would sit down and look at regularly, at least annually, if not a few times a year, for all the students in the building. So it might be academics, attendance, and discipline referrals are commonly used data points. Inevitably, you miss some of the students who have more internalizing behaviors when you do those data points. So it's just something to be considered when trying to connect students with the supports that they need. Tier 2 targeted interventions are generally offered, almost always offered by behavioral health staff who are trained and certified in delivering the either practice or curriculum. It's usually a small group. And some students will need more individualized or intensive supports, and those are really the students who would be eligible to receive tier 3 services. It tends to take the form of more individual counseling, and we'll get into it in a moment. And ultimately, some things just can't be treated on school grounds. In MTSS-B, we really prioritize that integrated school mental health model. And that often means having co-located mental health services on school grounds. So the school would partner with a community mental health agency and offer those services actually on school grounds. Sometimes it's not appropriate for various reasons, trauma or the nature of the need. And so there would be a facilitated referral process to another agency, or to maybe the same agency, for students to receive services off of school grounds as well. So just to dig in a little bit more to what are common supports at the tier 1 level that a school may implement. And if we're thinking about prevention, these are all things that help support students, all students. So every student will receive this, these supports that a school selects. Commonly, schools are encouraged to develop school-wide behavior expectations and an acknowledgement system, a universal social emotional learning curriculum to develop those core competencies for self-management and working with others, restorative practices, using school-wide data systems, consultation from behavioral health experts, and as well as health education programming. And this is really when a school may select a particular curriculum. So one evidence-based practice that's related to substance misuse, if the school had identified that that substance misuse is a community problem and maybe even a problem in the school building itself. An example would be Too Good for Drugs. That's an evidence-based practice that's actually K through 12. It's a curriculum that can be delivered, or infusing other preventative programming into existing health or wellness classes. And then, as I mentioned, the supports to help connect students to those higher tier services, so a social emotional screener or request for assistance. Common tier 2 interventions tend to be more small group, social skills, developing interventions, check-in, check-out is an evidence-based mentoring intervention. And then again, not only thinking about at this point, what is an intervention that we can implement for a small percentage of students. Usually it's about 15% of students that will respond to tier 2 interventions. But then also once individual students have been identified, also thinking about that individual planning and progress monitoring, which is the box that you see down there in the corner. So these tier 2 teams are thinking both about the interventions and the systems that they're creating and monitoring those, but also how do we support and track the progress of individual students. One tier 2, it really is a type of intervention, and a screener is the S.B.R.T, which is gaining some traction in New Hampshire schools, which is a universal screener for substance misuse. So that would be an example the school might select. And then common tier 3 interventions, again, tend to be almost always are more individualized, targeted interventions, usually take the form of either clinical services, individual therapies like CBT, multi-systemic therapy, wraparound services, renew. And again, that tier 3 team would also be thinking about that individual planning and progress monitoring for students. But this would be really a place, especially if you're with an organization that offers types of interventions for students who have demonstrated a need around substance misuse, that a partnership with the school is really, really valuable to help connect students to those services in the most seamless way possible. Lots of times we see barriers that prevent students from getting the supports they need, like transportation or even time if they're getting a student there, if they have a working parent or caregiver. So those partnerships are really critical. Okay, so as promised, the tool that you could use in your organization, and let me just, I'm going to put it in the chat now, but you may not want to open it immediately, just because it's a fairly large document, and I'm going to give a brief overview of it now, and then you have the full tool at your disposal. So this is called the Hexagon tool. It was developed by the National Implementation Research Network at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And it's really a tool for selecting and aligning strategies within an organization. And it's very applicable to schools, but it's really, as Molly had stated earlier, applicable in any setting, organizational setting. And it looks at 6 different indicators when you're selecting a program to assess the fit, feasibility, and readiness of both the implementing site, so meaning the environment, the organization itself. In this case, it might be a school, or it could be your own organization. And also programmatic indicators. So what are the indicators of the specific strategy or program or intervention that you're looking at? And then it breaks them down into those 3 subcategories. So when you're looking at the environmental indicators or the implementing site indicators, is there a need for the specific program that you're looking at in that environment? Is there the fit? So does it make sense? Does it align with other initiatives that are already taking place? And is there the capacity? Do the individuals within the organization have the ability to carry it out? Are the resources there for this particular program? And then the programmatic indicators include supports. So does the program that's being looked at have coaching supports, professional development, maybe ready to use curricula or guidance for the implementation? Is there evidence that this particular intervention or strategy works? Is it evidence-based or evidence promising? And is it usable? Is it ready to grab and be implemented by staff, or would it require a lot of training and capacity to implement? So on the next 2 pages, I won't go into these questions in great detail. And again, the tool that I put into the chat is the full Hexagon tool. And these are some of the questions that as a team, if you were looking at using or adopting a particular strategy or intervention, you could ask, and then you could, the tool allows you to score each of these, and then you'll end up with a raw number for each practice that you might be considering. So commonly in schools, they may be weighing 2 social emotional learning curriculum. And so they'll compare the 2 using this tool, and they'll find that the score for one is higher than the other, and that gives them some grounds for selecting and going with that particular curriculum. It could also be used for different types of screeners or any intervention really. And then the programmatic indicators, again, looking at that support, evidence, and usability. And as you go through the tool, giving a score for each of these items, well, it's actually an aggregate score for supports, evidence, and usability. And then you would total them at the end of the conversation with that team. And so on the next page, we have developed, in partnership with our partners at the Behavioral Health Improvement Institute at Keene State College, a tool, really, it's like an Excel spreadsheet, but it helps to tally the scores using the hexagon tool. So if you were to do this with a team, you could use the guiding questions in the tool that we dropped in the chat, and then also then enter the scores into this particular document, and it will tally them for you. So it's not a huge technological leap from using just the paper format of the hexagon tool, but it is kind of nice not to have to do the math yourself, I suppose. And it provides one place to compare really multiple programs, and it also can be shared easier with stakeholders. And we will before the end of this, we will drop a link both to the Technical Assistance Center website, which has our whole toolkit for MTSS-B, but also a direct link to this particular tool. So that brings us to the last step in the cyclical process of MTSS-B, which is monitoring progress. So within an organization, namely a school, usually the ones that we are working with, those tiered prevention team or tiered teams have been set up. They've looked at data, they've made a plan that has identified and selected specific strategies to use. And now we really encourage the monitoring of progress. It takes a lot of effort to get people together, to look at data, to select and invest in strategies, and to not monitor progress and continue to try to quality improve. It feels there's a term actually for it called initiative fatigue, and it can feel tiring to invest a lot of time in selecting a practice and put effort into it and then not know if it's working. And thank you, Molly, for putting the Technical Assistance Center website in the chat. So we really encourage schools and districts to measure both fidelity to a practice as well as the outcomes. And we actually do this on 2 levels, both the specific strategies or interventions that we've been talking about specifically today, selecting, but also to the MTSS-B framework as a whole. We measure fidelity and outcomes for that as well. But the reason that we want to measure both fidelity and outcomes is that fidelity is really measuring, are we implementing the practice as it was intended? And so we know if we're using a type of fidelity measurement, if something is being implemented as it was intended, or if we're not quite hitting the mark. And if we know that it was implemented as it was intended, and then we're looking at the outcomes, what we get as a result, and our outcomes are really improved, it's pretty sure that we can attribute that to the implementation with fidelity of the practice. But if we're not sure if we're implementing something as it was intended and we have a change in outcomes, we can't really be sure if the outcomes are the result of what we're doing. And so it's a way to improve the quality, but also know that the energy and resources that we're spending are working. So as I mentioned, we measure in our office for schools and districts how closely they are implementing with fidelity the MTSS-B model. And so this is an example of a tool that Molly or myself would use in a school who's put teams together to monitor their fidelity, and we administer this once a year. But if it's a specific, you can go ahead. But if it's a specific intervention or practice, lots of times if it's an evidence-based practice, it will already have its own fidelity tool developed. We can also help schools, districts, and stakeholders develop a fidelity tool. It's a pretty low lift, but it would have a huge impact on measuring what you're doing. So that's available, and also there's some guidance in the toolkit that Molly had dropped into the chat around developing a fidelity tool. Here's an example. This is a district that our office has been working with since 2014 to implement MTSS-B, and for outcome measures for MTSS-B, one of the common things we measure is discipline referrals. It's not the best indicator maybe of behavioral health and wellness, but it is a proxy for how well students are doing. And so the dark line there is the office discipline referrals per 100 students. The lighter blue line is their score on the MTSS-B fidelity inventory over time. So you can really see that in this district, as their fidelity to MTSS-B increased, for the most part, especially in the elementary schools, their office discipline referrals decreased and students were in class more. You do see the similar pattern at middle and high school. It is slower moving, generally speaking, in our work because of the nature of the way high schools and middle schools are set up. Students are moving more, they have more touch points with different staff members throughout the day. So systems change in a middle school and high school tends to take longer. And this is, so based on the same school district, these are the actual hours gained back by that decrease in office discipline referrals that occurred when the district was implementing MTSS-B. So you can see it's a huge amount of time for students to be back in class and learning, and also for administrators to be freed up to deal with other parts of their job that we know are so demanding and not handling discipline referrals. So this is one way that our office measures outcomes for MTSS-B in conjunction with the implementation of the framework. So this is really concludes the sort of informational portion of our session. Molly has put a direct link to the tool that we have developed at the New Hampshire MTSS-B Technical Assistance Center that goes along with the hexagon tool. And I think we might have just one more slide. So we want to make sure that all of those resources are available to you. And just really sum up here with what we hope you're taking away from the session today, which is a little bit better understanding of what MTSS-B is in New Hampshire. Again, Molly showed that map at the beginning of the session that shows the breadth and depth of the work that we're doing in New Hampshire. We're working with about 37 districts currently, or within the past 8 years, we've worked with 37 districts, but I think we're pretty close to 30 current districts as well. NERN's hexagon tool can help you in your organization, or if you're working with a school team, assess the fit and feasibility of an intervention or a practice you might be thinking about adopting, and really compare two practices that could serve the same end. And that our office has shifted to a regional model, so we're really focused on helping support districts, schools, and communities implement MTSS-B, and that's really what my role and Molly's role is, as well as Sam Ducharme is on this call as well. So he's our newest addition, a Lakes Region consultant, and that we're really a publicly available resource for schools and districts who are interested in engaging in this work. So I'd love to open it up for any questions that you may have, and this is of course our contact info.
Hi, Catherine and Molly. It's Ashley. I had a question about SBIRT and the use of that in schools in New Hampshire. I worked in Massachusetts, and it was something that was an unfunded mandate, which was not welcome with open arms in Massachusetts. But I know it's something that is used in primary care settings in New Hampshire. Have you worked with schools in New Hampshire that have implemented SBIRT as a universal screener?
Yeah.
And then I'll chime in.
Yeah. So in New Hampshire, we do have the non-academic screener law, meaning that we can't screen students for things other than academic kind of content areas without parent opt-in permission. So that's one of the considerations we make when we work with a school that is really looking at the SBIRT, because it is kind of based around brief interviewing and interventions for students. But when I have seen schools implement it, they tend to do it. Well, I'm thinking of one school in particular, sending out some of the parent information ahead of time. And really what the consideration is in New Hampshire is just the family engagement aspect of our work, engaging families in the conversation and what this is, and educating kind of all. And that's how they're able to move move the needle forward in implementing SBIRT. So that's kind of that's the New Hampshire as context of it. I'm not sure if you had like a very specific implementation question around it, but.
No, I was just curious, knowing that our other than the YRBS for now is opt-in for non-academic surveys. I wasn't sure if you had any successes or things like that, but the education ahead of time definitely is a useful strategy.
Yeah, I would say that has been a huge help. Also, taking advantage of the way they're like the benefits of technology, and so a lot of paperwork that schools need to complete now is done online. And so if there can be a way to digitize that opt-in, has been something I've seen, and also starting small. So maybe even focusing on a single class or a single grade in a school to say, we really want to try and do this universally for this whole grade or for this whole classroom. And how do we get the opt-in there? So it's a challenge because it takes a longer time to do that. But it can also give you some aggregate data if you're in a school of, what generally is happening for students in our school, and are there any school-wide decisions we'd want to make based on what we're seeing come back. But yeah, it definitely takes a little bit more time and planning to get that opt-in.
And there may not be a lot of questions right now, but if something kind of crops up, you're more than welcome to reach out to the email we had shared, or I can pop my email in the chat. We're always here to kind of answer questions or just provide guidance around the resources we've shared or other resources that you find on our website. So with that kind of concludes our presentation, but we appreciate you guys sitting in and learning, and we hope to hear from you guys in the future.